Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's book presentation. My name is Mariana Quiroz, and it's a great pleasure to host this academic dialogue on la Sociología Cultural en la Teoría Social, authored by Jean-François Côté and recently translated in Spanish by Lourdes Álvaro Romero under the critical review of Nelson Arteaga and sponsored by Secretaría de Ciencia, Humanidades, Tecnología e Innovación, who approves the project de la violencia estructural a la estructura cultural de la violencia. We are especially honored to have with us today Jean-François and Professor Jeffrey Alexander, whose foundational work in cultural sociology has shaped many of the theoretical questions we are addressing today. We also joined by two commentators on the book, Diana Ramírez and Melisa Rojo, as well as Professor Nelson Arteaga himself, whose intellectual guidance has been key to this Spanish edition. The aim of this event is to open a space for critical reflection on how cultural sociology continues to evolve and how Jean-François' work contributes to that evolution through a sustained dialogue with Jeff's intellectual legacy. So, la Sociología Cultural en la Teoría Social offers a concise yet comprehensive intellectual account of Jeff's trajectory, covering his evolution from structural functionalism through neo-functionalism to the development of the strong program in cultural sociology. But this is not just an intellectual biography. It is an invitation to revisit the journey behind a research project where cultural is placed at the very center of the sociological problem. In doing so, Jean-François retraces Jeff's critical engagement with classical sociological theory and the foundational tensions of modernity, offering a synthesized view of cultural performance, trauma, and the civil sphere. For that reason, the book reflects not only Jeff's intellectual journey, but also Jean-François' own theoretical sensibility. The book invites us to see Jeff's theoretical projects, performance theory, iconicity, civil sphere theory, as part of an ongoing dialogue about social meaning, integration, and the conditions for solidarity in modern societies. While some readers may find Jean-François' prose conceptually dense at times, the strength of the work lies in its capacity to make visible the inner logic of theoretical development, as well as in its invitation to reconsider the possibility of unifying framework in cultural sociology. So to begin with the discussion, as I said before, and Nelson too, we are joined by Diana and Melisa, our two commentators, whose academic work engages with questions of meaning, culture, and theory. First, we welcome Diana Ramírez Huerta, a sociologist from UAM Xochimilco. She holds a master's degree in government and public affairs. She is currently a doctoral candidate at FLACSO México in the doctoral program in social sciences with a specialization in sociology. And her research examines human rights in context of violence, collective action, and the dynamics of social conflict. Currently, she is developing a project on state-society conflicts surrounding the search for disappearing persons in Mexico between 2018 and 2024. And our second commentator is Melisa Rojo Aparicio, who holds a bachelor degree in international relations from ITAM and a master's degree in methods for public policy analysis from CIDE. She is also a doctoral candidate in the doctoral program in social sciences with a specialization in sociology at FLACSO México. And her dissertation explored the body as a symbolic space for meaning making beyond its material or instrumental dimension, focusing on sport through the lens of cultural sociology. After the comments, we will hear a response from Jean-François, followed by closing reflection from Jeffrey. So please, Diana, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I'll set the timer so I make sure I respect the logistics. So for me, it's a pleasure to be here, and I am very grateful to the invitation to comment on this book, as well for the virtual presence of Jeffrey and Jean-François, the author, whom I commend for the valuable work that bring us together today. Before beginning to present the book, I like to make a small disclaimer, because although I studied a degree in sociology, I had the fortune to approaching the strong program of cultural sociology only during my master's studies through a couple of seminars taught by Nelson, one where we discussed the cultural structures of violence, a topic of particular interest to me, and another fully dedicated to the theory of the civil sphere. That's why I see this book as a pedagogical tool for those of us who are interested in one of the most significant sociological enterprises of recent years. For those who, like me, had not yet had the opportunity to delve deeply into the strong program of cultural sociology, Côté's book is, in my view, an excellent entry point into the emergence and evolution of Jeffrey Alexander's sociological thought. So the discussion is organized into 6 chapters. The first chapter lays out the epistemological positioning, the logic and theoretical principles, the analytical fields, and methodological orientation of the strong program of cultural sociology. It introduces aspects that, in Côté's words, are the touchstones of this program, such as the autonomy of culture, analytical multidimensionality, the reflexivity inherent to sociological practice, and the inescapable relationship between theory and empiricism implied in scientific experience. Chapters 2 through 5 presents Alexander's rereading of the classics of sociology as a way of shaping his own project. Côté emphasizes Alexander's interest in reactivating the heuristic potential of these thinkers through a critique of the assumptions that ground their analysis and recontextualizations of these within a new analytical project. This is one of the aspects I value the most of the book, as it invites us to question the historical distance that separates us from the classics. In that sense, what does classical sociology have to say about contemporary social life? In this way, the book is also an invitation to revisit the classical sociological tradition and to explore its inherent possibilities and limitations. As Alexander has stated, we do not seek to dissolve its contradictions or renounce its principles, but rather to confront and overcome them. Thus, this program proposes a theoretical and epistemological refutation of sociology. The second chapter, focused on the reading of Durkheim, highlights three key aspects: the religious element in culture, ritual significance, and the symbolic forms of meaning making. Together, these aspects allow Alexander to argue in favor of the moral foundation of social order and the emotional motivations of action. That is, the predominance of symbolic representations within social structures. According to Côté, for Alexander, it is through the development of the sociology of religion that Durkheim is able to extract meaning and sense from social life. The third chapter presents a critique of Marxism, criticism, cultural studies, Bourdieusian determinism, and critical theory. For Alexander, the reductionism and determinism within these approaches eliminate the possibility for the actors to exercise reflexivity and participate in the codes and narratives of the cultural structures that surround them. By distancing himself from these theoretical developments, the critique of the critique seeks to return to politics what is essential in struggles over power, thereby revitalizing enthusiasm for political practices. Meanwhile, the fourth chapter, dedicated to political culture and civil religion, places the theorization of the civil sphere at the center of the analysis as a critical response to Weberian pessimism regarding the fate of modernity. According to Côté, Alexander's proposal, by locating symbolic action in close relationship with politics, drives a new theorization in which civil sphere appears as a point of convergence from which it becomes possible to articulate symbolic action with a normative cultural order. At the same time, the author emphasizes Alexander's interest in developing a project that, while maintaining its scientific orientation, rejects both empiricism without theory and excessively abstract formulations disconnected from empirical reality. Following this discussion, the fifth chapter delves into the development of the concept of the civil sphere, proposes as a surpassing of the Parsonian synthesis represented by the notion of societal community. Côté stresses here that in the analysis of symbolic actions of political nature, cultural sociology affirms the primacy of a symbolic order shaped primarily by culture and its autonomous capacity for development. From this perspective, the reconceptualization of civil society as a civil sphere entails not only an analytical and conceptual shift, but also carries practical implications. In this sense, Alexander's intellectual project advocates for a sociological praxis that engage in both theoretical innovation and in the active defense of fundamental civic principles such as pluralism, solidarity, and justice. The sixth chapter, in addition to crystallizing the theoretical and civic contributions of sociology to the civil sphere project, pays special attention to the relationship between the power of representation and the representation of power. For Côté, cultural sociology is innovative because it shifts the analysis of power from established structures toward the symbolic realm, showing that political power does not reside solely in formal institutions or established structures, but it is sustained and reproduced through symbols, narratives, rituals, and public performances. Finally, in the concluding section, Côté outlines both the present relevance and future prospects of this perspective within the field of social theory, emphasizing the need to address contemporary political dynamics through the lens of cultural analysis. He also underscores the importance of reasserting the normative committed embedded in the civil sphere project, commitments that speak to inclusion, civic equality, ethical responsibility, and the potential for collective solidarity in increasingly complex societies. I will also like to highlight the discussion about how this proposal entails not only an academic commitment but also a political one that challenges not only to understand social issues through a cultural lens, and perhaps we might be a bit optimistic, but above all to envision that democratic, inclusive, and just societies are indeed possible. We can see how this connects the academic discourse with a broader and social and political debates. Finally, I celebrate the fact that the book has been translated into Spanish because, on one hand, it broadens access to and understanding of this sociological project, and on the other, it opens the door to new appropriations, critiques, and reinterpretations of Alexander's proposal from other contexts and regions, something that is already happening as reflected in collective works such as the civil sphere in Canada, East Asia, and Latin America. This circulation of knowledge enables the analytical tools of cultural sociology, systematically revisited by Côté, to engage with the challenges our societies face. Struggles over meaning making in polarized contexts, narrative elaborations of cultural trauma in the case of war, violence, and genocides, processes of democratic erosion, past and present geopolitical tensions, and the subsequent expansion and restriction of solidarities, among others. It is enough to look at ongoing events, by no means distant or irrelevant to us, such as the war in Ukraine, the Israeli Palestinian conflict, the humanitarian emergency in the Democratic Republic of Congo, nuclear tensions in the Middle East, and so on. So I'll stop here, hoping to have offered you a carefully yet concise reading of the book and that my comments contribute to the posterior discussion. Thank you very much for your attention and again for the invitation to this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Now I'm going to give the word to Melisa for her reflection.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. First, thank you, Mariana, for the kind introduction, and Diana for guiding us through the contents of the book and sharing your own thoughtful and valuable insights. I'd also like to warmly thank our invited scholars, Jean-François, Jeff, Nelson, and although she's not in the room, I think I'd also like to mention the effort of Ana Lourdes for translating this book into Spanish. And of course, thank you all for being part of this conversation. It's a truly pleasure to present this book. What Jean-François offers here, it's not just a review of Jeff's work, but it is a carefully crafted conceptual map that helps us navigate one of the most ambitious sociological undertakings of the 21st century, the strong program in cultural sociology. The Spanish translation marks an important step in making this intellectual project more accessible to Latin American scholars, opening new dialogues and possibilities across contexts. Jean-François structures the analysis in this book towards answering three fundamental questions. Number one, to what extent can cultural sociology expand the reflexive analysis of meaning while also addressing critiques from Marxist or Bourdieuian perspectives? Number two, how can this theoretical program be compared or confronted with other approaches like historical sociology, pragmatic sociology, or systems theory? And finally, is it possible to bring together a hermeneutic structural approach centered on meaning with the dialectical demands of critical theory? From my perspective, Jean-François' achievement lies in condensing decades of intellectual development into a concise yet deeply thoughtful volume. In just over 170 pages, he aims to answer those questions through a sharp analysis of Jack's trajectory. From his roots in structural functionalism through his critique of Marxism and Bourdieu to the formulation of his own neo-functionalism and ultimately the Strong Program. Jeff's approach takes classical sociology as a toolbox to be reactivated. His work is fundamentally concerned in social transformation and with placing culture at the heart of the process, not as a reflection of the social, but as a constitutive force in itself. At the heart of Jeff's proposal is the concept of civil sphere, a space where ideals like justice, solidarity, and inclusion are not predefined but constantly reinterpreted and debated. This idea gives us a democratic lens for reading social life, one that values meaning-making and symbolic action. What stands out in Jeff's work and that Jean-François emphasizes is the insistence that culture matters. Rather than reduce culture to a reflection of social structures, he proposes that cultural codes are autonomous and capable of shaping social action. Actually, a very helpful clarification that Jean-François offers, and one that is often misunderstood, is the distinction between cultural sociology and sociology of culture. The latter, sociology of culture, typically treats culture as an object explained by external factors, while the former, cultural sociology, as proposed by the Strong Program, treats culture as a text, rich with meaning and structure, which must be interpreted, something that requires interpretation and not just an explanation. Jean-François highlights Jeff's use of symbolic action, dramaturgy, and the role of collective representations, what we might call the aesthetics of the social. This sociological perspective blends the theatrical with the analytical. Social life is performed, and understanding it requires interpreting the scripts, the stages, and the audiences. I'd say this book stands out because it offers a clear and rigorous introduction to Jeff's complex ideas. It also offers a bridge between Anglo-American, Francophone, and Latin American sociology, and it makes a strong case for why culture should be central and not peripheral to our sociological inquiries. Jean-François doesn't merely summarize Jeff's ideas. He interrogates them, challenges them, and places them within broader theoretical debates, always with the view toward enriching the conceptual tools we have for understanding contemporary society. This book is an invitation to think differently about sociology's role in interpreting meaning, and it's also a reminder that cultural structures are not passive. They are dynamic, contested, and central to the way societies organize themselves, respond to crisis, and imagine justice. Beyond its value as a theoretical synthesis, this book also offers productive avenues for research like my own, which focuses on the transformation of athletes into symbols. The Strong Program's emphasis on symbolic structures and deep cultural codes allows us to analyze how, when, and why certain bodies become carriers of meaning as heroes, myths, or icons within sporting narratives. Jean-François' interpretation of Jeff's works highlights the role of performance, representation, and civil drama, all of which are crucial to understanding how bodies are not only disciplined or celebrated, but also embedded in cultural struggles over identity, power, legitimacy, justice, and inclusion. Ultimately, Francois gives us more than just a review. He offers us a path to comprehend the proposed objectives of Jeff and the Strong Program in cultural sociology, an invitation to rethink the classical and contemporary sociology according to new paths and possibilities of development. So thank you all for being here, and I hope the discussion is very enriching for all of us.
Thank you so much, Diana and Melisa, for your thoughts. It's a real privilege to have your voices in this space. We're very grateful for the time, care, and sharp thinking you brought to today's conversation. And now I want to introduce Jean-François and Jeffrey, two figures whose intellectual contributions speak for themselves and maybe not require much introduction, but still I would like to briefly highlight a few elements of their long academic trajectories. Jean-François is full professor at the Department of Sociology at the Université du Québec at Montréal. He's also a co-director of JIRA and editor of the Americana series and has served as a guest professor in different countries as France, Austria, Brazil, and Mexico. And on the other hand, Jeffrey is professor of sociology at Yale University and co-director of the Center of Cultural Sociology. He is widely recognized as the founder of the strong program in cultural sociology, which emphasized the analytical autonomy of culture in the shaping social action. We are truly honored to have them both with us today. And remember, at the end, we will open the floor for question and answers. So please keep your questions and thoughts in mind. So Jean-François, please go ahead.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Quiero agradecer, bueno, evidentemente Nelson para su trabajo y also Ana Lourdes para su traducción y, disculpe, y quiero agradecer también a Diana, Melisa y Mariana para su presencia aquí hoy día. I'll switch to English now because I think that it's important for Jeff to be able to follow the conversation. It's very interesting because I don't have much to say after the presentation of the content of the book by Diana and the comment that followed by Melisa. So I'm not exactly sure what I could add to the picture that's been drawn so far. Let's just say that for me, it was important to write the book first in French and then in its English translation, and then now we have a Spanish translation, and I'm very happy with it so far. I haven't read the book entirely, the translation. I just received the book a couple of days ago, and but I read the prologue that Nelson wrote, and I do agree with just about everything that is said in there, and I'm quite happy too if the book can help enhancing the work that you've been mentioning on violence, political violence, or other aspects of human rights, and even athletes as icons, as Melisa has said in the end, because I think that Jeff's works is immensely rich and deep, and must be considered for just as sort of food for thought, that we have to use his works and to make it as productive as we can in the works that we are each doing on our sides, because I think that Jeff's works offer that, and that's precisely what got me attracted to his works first. I realized that starting with his monumental theoretical logic in sociology, I was facing certainly one of the most prominent figures in sociological thought today. So that was my first interest when I sort of, I had read here and there pieces Jeff wrote before. I even bought, I remember that, when the Civil Sphere book was launched at the American Sociological Association. I was there, and I had bought a copy, but I had never met Jeff in person at that time, back then. And the book, the Civil Sphere book, sat there on my table for a couple of years, I have to say. And it's only when I started to work really on the book that I devoted a careful reading of this other monumental book that came like almost 20 some years after theoretical logic in sociology. And then I realized that we had a systematic thinker there at work, even though there are some different phases in the development of Jeff's works. There is something that appears as a clear line of development in his works, and you can retrieve traces of that in theoretical logic and up to his most recent works that we haven't thought that we talked that much so far, but maybe we will, on iconic consciousness and things like that. So I got interested in Jeff's works, and the more I got interested into it, the more I sort of gathered from it, and I kept accumulating some some interest first in deepening his line of thought, and I also got interested in nurturing my own reflection about sociology while doing so. And I think that this is what is important in Jeff's works, is that it's not some kind of work that sort of keeps things for itself, but it on quite the opposite way, it opens up on many different directions. And I think that each of us can benefit from appropriating this work in our own works. So I have the feeling that's exactly what you're doing right now, at least Diana and Melisa, and of course Nelson, who's been I think the first Mexican scholar to pay such attention to Jeff's works, participating at the Center for Cultural Sociology at Yale University. That's how I met Nelson in the first place. That was in 2019, I believe, and I think that he's done a great job teaching cultural sociology in Mexico, working with cultural sociology in his books, and appropriating for himself the kind of work that Jeff was doing and applying to his own specific context in Mexican society. I'm very sensitive also about all that's been said about the relevance of Jeff's works to analyze contemporary society in any kind of context, be it the Canadian context, the Mexican context, the context in the US or anywhere else. And as the Civil Sphere book series show, there is a lot of possible applications of this work. And I think this is why it is so important, interesting, and relevant for us to read today. I think I'm going to just stop there. I think I've said enough, and if ever there are some questions, then I'll be happy to answer. And I think that Jeff might want to comment too on his side.
So should I just start? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first I wanted to thank and to acknowledge Nelson for being, as Jean-François said, a kind of a hub in his own right, an intellectual center, not just in Mexico, but in Latin America and perhaps also Spain. I wrote an early essay on Durkheim, and I called it On the Anxiety of Mal Entendu, on the anxiety of being misunderstood. And I said that Durkheim's the reception of Durkheim's division of labor and society and his rules of sociological method were very frustrating to him, because he was interpreted almost the opposite to how he saw himself, which doesn't necessarily mean he was wrongly interpreted, but he felt he wasn't. I believe he was half. And so, that's the first thing I want to say, that I believe that it's a great pleasure and satisfaction to me to be understood, as I think my work is. And that's part of performance. As an actor, and intellectuals are actors and theorists, to be understood, to create books that are objects and throw them out to audiences. And it's been a tremendous, satisfying pleasure to be understood by Nelson, but also by Jean-François. And also, I want to note that in the back of all of this is a man who some of you know named Carlo Tognato, who may have been the first person to work with my theory, in a way, introduce it to Nelson as well, at least parts of it. More so, but he's withdrawn from academic life. Why has Jean-François been able to, I'm going to make a few remarks about his book from my perspective, why he's been able to so penetrate so deeply into my own ideas, so much so that I understand myself differently by reading his account of my work. You understand yourself through the eyes of others sometimes, which is what George Herbert Mead might have said, and Jean-François is an expert on George Herbert Mead. I think it's because he and I share similar backgrounds in a sense, that he is both, on the one hand, a systematic, philosophically informed social theorist, and he's also interested in aesthetics. His own work on theater, on drama, on novelists, on poets, on indigenous work. So I believe that's why he and I jive in this way, and why he has come to my work, being able to understand and articulate cultural meanings and social performances. And also his work, his deep knowledge of Mead, which is, he has his own interpretation, which emphasizes more the generalized other than most interpretations of Mead, is very important, I think, in coming to grips with my work. Also, by coming into a relation to my work in a way after it was finished, not that it is finished, but after the research programs have been articulated. I know this sounds a little strange, but my work obviously changed and developed in dynamic ways over 40 years, maybe longer than 40 years. And only at the end of it, unless you were a student of mine, and even then, is it possible to see the coherence of the work and to take it as it is. So when I, for example, made the move towards cultural pragmatics, most of the people who interpreted my work up to that point, which was the early 2000s, they didn't take that term seriously. They said, well, let's start in the beginning. When I moved to cultural sociology in the late 80s and early 90s, people said no, they didn't see that as something that had its own integrity, but they were focusing on the period before, neo-functionalism. They wouldn't let me, let's say, move out of what I had been, even though I had theorized the movement myself. Then as I moved towards pragmatism, it was, no, you're a symbolic theorist. You can't incorporate pragmatism into that. That's just not working. So whereas you, Jean-François, came and you saw, yeah, this is it. You took it as as things that did exist, and you looked at them as from the end, in a way like the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk, Hegel's famous phrase. I feel that the intellectual community, who both generations older than me, my generation and younger, as I moved through the phases of my development, they didn't move with me. Only some people moved with me. And there was always a problem of understanding my work, which I think now, as I come to the end of my career, I feel people are understanding me better now. A few specific points. One is that Jean-François' emphasis on reading is very interesting and I think very original and important, which is in Anglo-American positivist sociology, the notion is that theory is based on observations and inductions, on empirical insights. But from the French perspective, and perhaps the Spanish, I don't know the Spanish very well, the notion of reading is critical. And you have this constant term, relire. One must relire, reread something as combined with theorizing and empirical work. And that's a hermeneutical perspective on theory making and even on empirical research, which is that finding new things in the empirical world are related to rereading major theoretical traditions that provide the classical foundations, the sea within which we, as fish, swim, and we aren't aware of that. So I think the way that he's seen my work in terms of rereading and putting that not in the past as one phase of my work, but actually as a context for the middle level theories that I've developed, middle level macro theories like civil sphere or social performance or trauma or icon, it makes a connection which only somebody as steeped A, in the French tradition as he is, and B, in the hermeneutic tradition. He and I both share a deep sympathy with Dilthey, Ricoeur, and the hermeneutic tradition, which is not very widespread actually in at least American and British sociology, or even a lot of German sociology. The second thing I'd say, which is unique and related to what I've just said, is the holism, which was mentioned by the commentators. To see my work as a whole, and to make it into a whole, that's an amazing intellectual accomplishment. It's almost impossible to do. And you did that, Jean-François, and it's an act of interpretation and it's an act of theorizing in itself. And it was, to me, electrifying, really, to read the book first in French and in English, because I wasn't able to see my own work in that way. Of course, this tradition makes things very neat, which I appreciate, because it was a mess for me as I lived through these 40 years of writing. Another thing is the aesthetic. I think one of the commentators talked about the aesthetics of the social. And that is a critical part of my cultural sociology. I feel that your interpretation, Jean-François, is very attuned to that, sensitive to that, and emphasizes that we really live as social beings in an aesthetic world not meaning the world of art, but that we're aesthetic creatures as we are symbolic creatures, so that the dramaturgical aspects of life, the meaning-making aspects, the narratives, the codes, the constant struggle over interpretation and the struggle to reinterpret as we move through and to create new meanings is very hard for the sociological tradition, well, social science, well, let's say political science and sociology, to understand. And I love the way that Jean-François recreated that, or reconstructed it in this masterpiece of interpretation, that the symbolic order is real, and that it's the world we're all in. And I think he and I both share the feeling that the world of art and the world of society are, of course, they're separated in modernity as different realms, but really the tools, and this is because the key to my cultural sociology is I've used a series of concepts from the humanities, from art history, from literature theory, and others. I've brought them into sociology and tried to sociologize them in a sense. Another part, which is both a rhetorical, one has to appreciate the rhetoric, the French use of rhetoric in this book, the elegance, in other words, of the phrase making. So the critique of power versus the power of critique. Now, that is in a way a beautiful phrase, but it's also theoretically substantive, in that the way I see contemporary societies, especially democratic ones, but not only, I would include really all societies, is that the relative autonomy of the symbolic order from any particular, from the given social structural arrangements, allow for continuous criticism of social structures and other symbolic structures, or let's say the way that a particular social structure institutionalizes broader and more generalized cultural meanings, so that my civil sphere theory, but also cultural trauma theory, are ways to explain the fact that we live in a very critical society, a society that's continuously reconstituting itself through criticisms, but not criticisms in the Habermasian sense of rational critique, but criticism in a more aesthetic sense of bringing to bear meanings that are highly generalized and relatively transsituational to bear in conflicts over meaning. The last thing is reflexivity. I'm glad to see, I think that's connected to the notion of criticism and reflexivity. I think that there's some ambiguity in Jean-François' emphasis on the reflexivity in my theory, and his critique of that I have a static social order, and that you need to have a dialectical approach rather than a structural approach. That's the only aspect of his interpretation I don't accept, but of course it's the most critical one. So that would be understandable. So I've talked longer than 10 minutes, but I hope that has been productive. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, Jean-François, for your rich and layered discussion. We will now like to open the floor for question and reflection from the audience. So please raise your hand or use the chat if you are joining remotely. We ask that question be concise so that we can hear from as many voices as possible. Anyone? Okay, Melisa actually have a question, so I'm gonna give mic to her.
Thank you. Well, profiting from this opportunity, I'd love to pose a question to each of you. It's connected with my doctoral research, and I'd love to hear your opinion. The first one is for Jean-François. I actually had the opportunity to access two of the theses you directed at your university, UCAM, and they were focused on embodied practices like karate and ballet. And I've been finding them really enjoyable with a lot of theoretical insights. And my question is, how would you say we could better defend that the body, despite its material solidity, is a symbolic site where different values like legitimacy or worthiness are disputed? And if I could make the question for Jeff. Your theory of the civil sphere highlights symbolic codes that, after dispute, might foster solidarity, inclusion, and also democratic repair. But sports, by their very design, are structured around contest, around hierarchy, and the production of winners versus losers. So, do you think the competitive nature of sport could challenge the integrative aims of the civil sphere, or could these antagonistic performances also serve as a space where inclusion and exclusion are actively negotiated? Small disclosure, I've read some of the work from Trygve Brock, but his work is based or analyzed in Norway, which I think it's a really special form of society. So in the rest of the world, maybe my question makes a little bit more sense. Thank you.
You want me to go first? Or
Anyone has another question of you prefer first answer Melissa's questions?
Let's do one. Let's answer these questions first.
Okay, great.
so you want me to go first, or? Yeah, okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Melissa, for your question. For us to recognize or acknowledge that the body is symbolic is sort of coming to terms with something which is so obvious in social life that it's very surprising that sociology can deal with the body otherwise. That's how I would put it that way first. Because, I mean, as soon, of course you can go with very, general concepts like the person. Well, the person, which means like the concept as a person, as a universal concept, applies to everybody, right? So, I mean, in our societies nowadays, it's not always been like that, but for us, so I mean, even being an individual and being for that respect, like in that respect, a person is already deeply, deeply symbolically institutionalized, right? But of course, we don't see that because we don't see symbolic mediations. They're not apparent. That's the very nice things about symbols. They disappear as soon as we use them in language, for instance, and they disappear because they open our eyes to something that they direct our view to, right? But if you take it in a very basic way, like human beings have always considered themselves symbolic. Even, primitive societies, let's say first human societies, people were, tattooing themselves, wearing clothes, wearing any kind of things that were unnatural and became symbolic, right? They considered themselves, anthropologically speaking, humans considered themselves, I've always considered themselves symbolically. That's the very basic thing, right? Now, it's very interesting that sociology does not acknowledge that, or some sociologies don't acknowledge that as first, since any society, any human society, prioritize this kind of symbolic embodiment of the body, if you will, right? So nowadays, it can take as many forms as you can think of. I mean, you're working on sports, and I think that, of course, sports and human bodies in sports are highly symbolic of everything our society puts in there, right? In terms of competition, in terms of the play that sport is basically, in terms of the social interactions between what is shown in sports and the people who look at sports, right? All this is possible only because everything in there is made through symbolic mediations. That's the real stuff of human life. Human symbolic, like symbolic mediations. That's the stuff that we're made of, right? Of course, with language, but also with our bodies, because we make them significant. We make them signify something, always, right? So you mentioned two dissertations that were that I supervised. One on ballet, and the other one I didn't clearly understand what it was, but clearly understood the word that you said. But
Sorry, it was karate.
karate.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, I'd forgotten that one, although it's the most recent one of the two. But and in these two cases, that's exactly what was at stake. I mean, showing that in these different, although it was completely two different contexts, right? But in the two domains of dance, ballet, and karate, you have the same kind of symbolic instructions given to the body in order to have it to conform to some social norms, some social aesthetics, some social ideals, and there you go. There is nothing in the formation of the body as such that is not symbolic. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
And now it's Jeff's turn to answer Melissa's question, please.
Let me just say that a student of mine published a book, edited a book last year where she has a very, very long introductory essay, and the book is called Interpreting the Body Between Meaning and Matter. It's published by Bristol University Press. The student's name is Anna Marie Champagne, and it's co-edited with Asia Friedman, who's a professor at University of Rhode Island. And it's using iconicity as a way of thinking about the body. But I agree with everything Jean-François said. In terms of the question you ask about sports, I mean, the first thing is, of course, that many things in our society are not compatible or are in conflict with the civil sphere. I mean, so the market economy, although it has dimensions of civil sphere inside of it, it's certainly intention. The state is intention, religion, family. So, in fact, that's one of the premises of of the civil sphere, which comes out of a very long tradition, of course, from Spencer to Durkheim to Parsons to Luhmann about the differentiation of spheres, Michael Walzer, spheres of justice. The innovation of the civil sphere is to say, though, that the tension between, or the independence or relative autonomy of these spheres is relative, and that it's open to interpretation, and that there are times there, for example, when what goes on in a non-civil sphere comes to be interpreted by some groups as destructive intrusions on the ideals of the civil sphere, in which case they, agents of the civil sphere, there's a kind of societalizing process, and they will try to reconstruct or repair aspects of that non-civil activity, so that when we look at the capitalist economy, for example, we can see many repairs that have been made since the mid-19th century, spearheaded by trade unions, by social democratic socialist parties, progressive movements, like the limiting of the working hours, like the recognition of trade unions, negotiation over working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is true in sports because there are, on the one hand, sports are extremely aggressive activity where you have a winner and a loser. And the winners get all the rewards and losers get nothing. That's not a very solidaristic situation, is it? So it rewards, intense aggression and domination, you could say. And often physical aggression as well. At the same time, there's a difference between a sport and a war, which is the notion of the rules of the game. And so in that sense, and there's a referee, there's a third party. So when we look at sports, we can look on it as in some way a synecdoche of the civil sphere, or as a microcosm, in the sense that you have to play by the rules. And if you don't, you're polluted, you're punished, you're kicked out of the game. At the worst, you can be fined. And poor sportsmanship is really, really polluted, just as in a civil sphere, people who are, let's say, break the law, steal, murder, act in an illegal manner are polluted. So I think you could, it would be interesting to trace the movement of games going back to very early societies. Earliest, like the Mayan civilization or the Incas or the Aztecs, look at the emergence of games. Some people have said it a way of civilizing aspects of warfare. The other thing is that in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries, in the last 30 years, there's been more than, I'd say, 75 years. There's a criticism, for example, of American sports as racist. The whiteness of sports in the 50s was considered a a destructive intrusion because of the success of the Black civil rights movement. And then there began a systematic civil repair that brought non-white people into sports. It's not just an automatic demographic process. It's a very complicated symbolic confrontation that has to do with what the relation of sports to the ideals of the civil sphere. And in regard, this is also very interesting in regard to gender, because in the United States, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 had a major element called Title VII, which said that education had to be equal for all races and genders. And this stipulation became, which was not really noticed at the time, was put in by a female senator, became an explosive and very powerful legal element, which through a series of decades of adjudication required American colleges and universities to give as many scholarships to women athletes as to male athletes. And that made women's sports very significant in the United States. And I don't know if it had an effect in other countries, but I imagine it did as well. So this is, I think, an example of the relation of sports to the civils. Now, of course, Trygve Brock's book looking at Norway is he shows how the sports there are very actively, reconstructed in a multicultural and democratic way. It's amazing. And as you say, hardly any of us live in Norway, and it's a remarkable society. And but yet, even in a country as fallen as the United States, we still have some of those same processes.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, we have a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation and the comments. I just have one question to Jeffrey Alexander. Why don't you agree with the idea of the dialectic part of the book? Can you please talk a little bit more about that element? Thank you.
The reason I disagree with it is that I think that my work shows the dynamism of Western societies over the last few hundred years, so that in terms of the civil sphere, I would defend the idea that the discourse of civil society is stable, and that it has been stable for 2,500 years, since the Greeks, although it's elaborated differently in many different contexts, and there hasn't been a civil sphere for most of the last 25 years. But for me, because of the relative autonomy of culture, that means that the structure of the binaries of the discourse are separated from any particular institutionalization of that discourse in any society, in any time and place. It's the very, in a sense, solidity of the binary structure that allows groups to transform the meanings of citizenship in their own societies, so that when women became citizens, they used this structure and said they re-represented themselves and became members, fuller members of the civil sphere. In that sense, and they expanded, perhaps this is, the notions of what rationality might mean, so that people would say, like, well, maybe a woman might be a better president than a man, or maybe other people say, no, there's only one form of rationality. So I think that the dynamism of the dialectical or dynamic aspect of societies is not undermined by recognizing, in the case of the civil sphere, that there is a relatively unchanging structure of discourse, in my view, because democracy, a self-regulating society, we could say a civil sphere, can only be understood, can only be sustained if we grant it certain properties like honesty, peacefulness, rationality, autonomy, openness, things like that. I don't see, you could say that comes from a tradition. You could also say it comes from simply the necessity of that. The other thing is that in other parts of my work that aren't about the civil sphere, for example, trauma theory, cultural trauma theory is about the creation of new social meanings and new social objects. Like in my essay on the Holocaust, I talk about the very concept of the Holocaust not even existing in the first 20 years after the actual mass murder of the Jews. And is there a structural aspect to trauma theory? I think there is. So I'm defending the dynamism of structural hermeneutics.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Diana.
I would like to pose a question to Côté, because as we were discussing, the book is a systematical yet critical lecture from the enterprise of Alexander. So I found the discussion about the structural hermeneutics and the critique of the paradoxical nature very interesting. So could you share with us what implications this proposal, the dialectical hermeneutics, has for the description of the mechanisms operating within the civil sphere, please?
Yes, well, I think that there's not, how would I phrase that? There is not like a categorical opposition between a structural or dialectical hermeneutics. But I think, and this has been made clear, I think, by a recent article by Nelson published in Thesis 11, where he analyzes this opposition between dialectical and structural hermeneutics, and he comes to, I think, a nice understanding of how they fit together as being two different phases of a dynamic process that Jeff just talked about. Because maybe with one little difference is that when you think about things in terms of a dialectical hermeneutics, in my perspective, you're more open to realize the transformations that have occurred within a specific social and historical period. For instance, if you think about like 200 years ago, the terms that were structured to define bourgeois democracy, right? Who could be a citizen in bourgeois democracy? It was only men who had some property, right? They were the bourgeois citizens, like mainly, which excluded people who had no property and who were not men. And basically we can say white men, right? Because within European societies of the time, citizenship was considered like that. That how it was structured, framed, coded legally, right? Now, since then, and in the course of the 19th and 20th century, the notion of citizenship has evolved quite a lot to include, it has expanded to include people without property, everybody else, not only men, but everybody else in society. We've become mass democracies, and then the content of citizenship as such, as it is defined, coded, structured, has switched to something else, something different. And if we keep in mind that the new stability, and here I agree with Jeff, that there is a new stability that is being put forward when these transformations are institutionalized. But that being said, we have to realize that between bourgeois modern democracy and mass democracies of postmodern societies, if you will, I would agree that since the 19th century, we've moved outside sort of the social and historical period called modernity and entered a new phase of structural transformation for our societies. And if you locate these, then you see the new forms of social life that correspond to the transformations that have occurred time, right? So that's what I'm saying. If I can take an example in Jeff's works, when he analyzes, and I think that was maybe the first case study that he took, analyzing the Watergate. And the analysis that he does of the Watergate crisis in the United States is very interesting, and it's very carefully studied and analyzed by Jeff all along its development. But when this crisis is resolved, Jeff sort of reaffirms the reestablishment of the moral philosophy that was polluted and put at risk by what came to be known as the Watergate crisis, without acknowledging, though, in his analysis, the changes that have occurred in this moral philosophy and in the structure of society as such also. Because, for one example there, the role of media in the Watergate crisis have made the media the fourth power, you know, in our mass democracies, right? Media are extremely important now. We see the present debate between the now current president of the United States and media, and this is precisely what is at stake. He's fighting the power of the media because he certainly knows that media can drive the fall of a presidency, as it happened with the Watergate crisis, because it's it's the media that took the crisis to the level of a crisis, right? And Jeff's analysis shows exactly that. the move within public opinion and stuff like that. But it does not sort of underscore this idea that then the media have become something crucial for the structuration of our type of society. And it was certainly not exactly the case, or not a case that could challenge the presidency 50 years before the Watergate crisis. Now, will this situation prevail for the next 50 years? We don't know. It's at risk right now because the current president of the United States is working very hard to try to undermine media power. So that's one thing. The other thing that Jeff does not mention is in his analysis, by claiming that it has reestablished confidence in the presidency as an institution in the United States, is that ever since the Watergate crisis, every presidency has had its gate scandal, be it the Iron Gate for Reagan, the Zipper Gate for Clinton, etc., etc. So there's a kind of cynicism that has sunk in moral philosophy in the United States with respect to the institution of the presidency. And this, I think, is also another change that you have to take into account when you do such an analysis. Instead of sort of reaffirming the stability of the institution that is in place, you can realize, I think, that it has been shaken on its base, and it is still shaken by that. And the people that sort of have this sort of cynicism with respect to the presidential institution or the presidency in the United States is a witness to that, I think. I'm not exactly sure that I answered your question, but please feel free to add some more sub-questions to it if I didn't.
Probably I will send you an email.
Jeff,
But thank you so much.
Jeff, I don't know if you want to add something to this, the Jean-François reflection.
I mean, I think that it's a matter of levels. Many things change and many things stay the same. My argument with Watergate was that that the ideals, the relatively autonomous cultural ideals of democracy were reaffirmed and revivified by the crisis, the way it was resolved. But I did emphasize that there were new institutional developments. For example, I talked about the emergence, because of Watergate, of white-collar crime as a new unit in the at all levels of city, state, and national policing systems. So I talked about institutional change. I also talked about the emergence of gate as a metaphor that came out of Watergate, and have referred to it since. In other words, I don't know that Jean-François and I actually disagree. I think we're emphasizing different levels. And for me, it's interesting, and of course it's very controversial to take a structural analysis a la Lévi-Strauss or Saussure and to say that some aspect of democracy hasn't changed for 2,500 years. That seems totally absurd and ridiculous. I mean, and I knew that that was something that was very contentious to say. but I would defend that. I think, but yet the way that these terms are understood and institutionalized changes constantly. So, to me, that's something interesting, not a contradiction, but something that's a productive. The relationship between signifier and signified is always open. To me, that's the lesson of post-structuralism, and I think that's fundamental. Therefore, the fighting over what these generalized cultural terms actually mean for us now, that's always something that's always changing. So that's kind of how I would interpret this. Yeah.
It's also because I agree with what you just said, and also it's probably because of the semiotic model that we're using. I'm referring rather, and there's somewhere in the footnote in the book that I refer to semiotics in a Peircean sense, which instead of having this sort of opposition between signifier and signified, you have a ternary structure between object, sign, and interpretant. So, and it's a very dynamic model in itself. Now, the problem, of course, with that is how do you stop this sort of interpretant in order to have it so stabilized that people can understand each other, right? Because in Peirce, it's not always as clear as it could be. But anyhow, yeah.
And I would respond to that by saying that social performance model is a way of expanding the notion of interpretant, that I don't see the semiotic as something that operates by itself. It doesn't,
No, of
it's
course
not a Hegelian way of doing it, but I don't. So I feel I made a very significant change in my theorizing when I developed social performance, and I feel that it's in the spirit or compatible with Peircean notions of the interpretant, but it's a different language. So in terms of my theory as a whole, I'm certainly not a Saussurean.
Jeff, sorry, we can hear you. Now we can hear you, but we didn't hear anything you said before. So if you
Really?
can elaborate, please.
You want me to repeat everything I just said?
As much as you can.
Try to.
Try to.
I understood. Your voice was at my end.
What I said is that while Peircean idea of semiotics is more dynamic than Saussurean because he includes the interpretant in it, if you look at my theory as a whole, once I developed the model of cultural pragmatics, the social performance model, that, in my view, is a way of elaborating a systematic theory of interpretant, of the mediation between the signifier and the object. It introduces a dynamism so that I don't regard myself as my whole theory is not a Saussurean theory, not at all. But what I take from Saussure is a theory of meaning making in terms of symbolic relations of binaryism. I believe that on the cultural level, an important aspect of meaning making is his insight that meaning is relational and it's made by comparison. And the language of signifier and signified, but that is So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I think that, it was many, many years ago, back in the early 90s, when Mustafa Emmerbeyer, I was at a conference, and you may know Emmerbeyer as a pragmatist. He's a Bourdieusian too, but he's also a pragmatist. And he told me that my theory was wrong because Peirce was right and Saussure was wrong. And that was a big stimulus for me to try to develop performance theory and cultural pragmatics.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't know if we have another question, comment, if anyone in the chat have something to say.
¿Cuál es la razón que tiene este autor que usted ha publicado durante 2019?
This is impossible. We can't understand. We can't hear what's being said. What's being said now? I mean, I can't hear anyway. I don't know if Jeff did, but
No, I couldn't hear what the speaker was saying. The connection seems to be a little fragile at the moment. Now I think we've lost. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to ask because it's your work and how you relate with your region.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, what is your relation with Latin American region, your work and Latin America? That was the question.
Well, I worked with Carlo Tognado on the civil sphere in Latin America. And that was the first, and that was the beginning of a long series of efforts to relate the civil sphere theory to away from North America. And I think that Nelson participated in that. Several people associated with FLACSO and from other countries in Latin America. So, and a lot of new ideas about the civil sphere came out of that project, like interstitial institutions, like multiple discourses in the public spheres that aren't civil. For example, a hierarchical discourse like hacienda discourse. And I've continued to have work with doctoral students from Latin America over the years, and have learned a lot from as they adapt and use and revise my theories in relation to Latin America. My own experience, I've spent a lot of time of my life in Mexico, and trying to understand Mexico in its transition, both as it was and in the years of its transition towards a more democratic society. I've had very close personal relationships with people in Mexico over the last 30 years.
Thank you, Professor Jeffrey. My suppositions are confirmed. Thank you.
Well, we wrap up, I want to thank our commentators, our speakers, and especially all of you for being part of this exchange. For final words, we have Professor Nelson to goodbye.
Thank you very much, Jeff, Jean-François, Diana, Mariana, Melisa. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and the discussion. This discussion was very interesting, and I think that it's an important moment to introduce in a very straightforward way the cultural sociology and the discussion of civil sphere theory. And thank you very much to be here with us. I have two announcements. The first one is that in September we have a presentation of a book, Dramatic Intellectuals, edited by Javier Perez Jara and Nicolás Rudas, both of them members of the Center of Cultural Sociology. And also in September, we will have a presentation of the dossier of the journal Perfiles Latinoamericanos about democracy, civil sphere, and autocracies in the Americas. And that's it. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your time. Jean-François, thank you very much for your time. And thank you for all of you to be here. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Me falta mucho México.
Aquí te esperamos, Jean-François. Thank you, Jeff.
Sí.
See you soon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.